Have you ever heard of a 5-year-old girl who became a mother? Not a rumor, not a myth. A documented, medically verified case that still haunts doctors more than 80 years later. Her name was Lina Medina, a child from a remote village in Peru. And in 1939, she was taken to a hospital with what doctors thought was a tumor. But when they prepared for surgery, what they found instead changed medical history forever. Tonight, we'll uncover how a little girl's body defied science and how the world turned her suffering into spectacle. From X-rays in medical journals to the headlines that made her a global fascination, and the silence that followed when the cameras disappeared. This is not a story about miracles. It's a story about neglect, exploitation, and the cost of curiosity. Welcome to Dark History. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe. And as always, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Because by the end of this video you might start to wonder not how this happened, but why the world was so eager to watch. In the spring of 1939, the small hospital in Pisco, Peru, prepared for a surgery no one questioned. The patient was a child, 5 years old, small even for her age, carried in her mother's arms like she was still a toddler. Her abdomen had been swelling for months. Villagers whispered it was a tumor. Her parents, poor and frightened, had finally traveled for help after the child began to complain of pain that came in waves. Doctors examined her under the harsh electric light of the ward. Her belly was round, taut, and full. It looked nothing like a child's stomach. No malnutrition, no bloating from disease. It was firm, symmetrical, abdominal mass, the chart read. A surgeon signed off for exploratory operation. The mother sat quietly in the corridor, clutching a shawl. She did not speak much Spanish, only Quechua, and could not understand most of what was being said. To her it was simple. Her daughter was sick and doctors would remove whatever was growing inside her. The child Lina sat on the table motionless, her eyes tracing the instruments laid beside her. She said nothing. When a nurse asked where it hurt, she only pointed to her belly and looked away. One of the doctors, Dr. Gerardo Lozada, had doubts. The swelling was too even. There were no signs of malnutrition or internal bleeding. He placed his hand gently over her abdomen. It was firm, but he could feel movement beneath. He paused, looked at the nurse, then placed his stethoscope again. There was rhythm, not digestive noise, not random shifting, but a steady repeated sound. A heartbeat. Lozada asked for another doctor. They repeated the exam, then an intern, then the head of the department. No one said the word aloud at first. They simply looked at one another, each waiting for someone else to dismiss what they were thinking. The silence grew heavy in the room. An X-ray was ordered. The machine hummed and tired. His child lay perfectly still as the plate captured what the stethoscope already suspected. When the image developed, the staff crowded around it. Technicians, nurses, surgeons. In the dim red glow of the dark room, the outline was unmistakable. The curled spine, the skull, the tiny limbs. It wasn't a tumor. It was a fetus. Full term, ready to be born. The room fell silent. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Someone muttered that it was impossible, that the machine was defective. Another ordered the test repeated. The second plate showed the same result. A heartbeat inside a heartbeat. Dr. Lozada returned to the child's mother, who waited outside with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Through a translator, he told her what the X-ray revealed. She shook her head, certain she had misheard. When the translator repeated it, she began to tremble. There was no reaction of joy or disbelief, only quiet terror. In the medical notes, the language was cold. Diagnosis, pregnancy, approximately 7 months. No one wrote what they felt when they saw the image for the first time. A 5-year-old girl carrying a child. A biological impossibility now proven. They led the operation. Instead, they prepared for delivery. The doctors who had been trained to heal disease now faced something they couldn't explain. Something that violated every rule they knew. That night, Lozardo stayed late, staring at the X-ray pinned to the light board. The image glowed faintly in the dark room, a child's skeleton containing another. For the first time in his career, he could not decide whether he had witnessed a miracle or a crime. Long before the doctors in Pisco would learn her name, Lina Medina lived in a place so remote that maps barely noted it. Tipo, a cluster of clay houses tucked into the Peruvian Andes. The village sat between dry ridges and narrow terraces of maize. Life there was predictable, bound to weather and soil. Most families like the Medinas survived on what they grew. Her father worked seasonally, taking whatever labor he could find. Her mother tended the small patch of land behind their home, grinding maize by hand, caring for her children, and bartering what little surplus they had in the village square. No one in Tycho owned much and no one expected more. There were no doctors, no clinics, not even a schoolhouse that stayed open through winter. Illness was handled by faith and folk remedies. What couldn't be cured was left to God. The Medina family spoke mostly Quechua. Spanish, the language of officials and doctors, was something distant, a tongue for other people. That distance mattered more than they could have known. It meant that when something strange began to happen to their youngest daughter, there were no words for it. In Ticarapo, the body was not discussed. Children were raised to be quiet, obedient, and unaware. Girls were taught modesty before they were taught reading. When sickness came, it was whispered about. When bleeding came, it was hidden. Mothers passed down silence because they had inherited it themselves. Lina was small, shy, and observant. She rarely cried, rarely laughed loudly. Her mother later said she was a good child, never troublesome. In a village where everyone worked from dawn until night, a quiet child was considered blessed. There was no reason to notice anything unusual. But then, sometime between her second and third year, her mother began to notice odd signs. The way the child's body seemed to change faster than her age, or odd how her stomach softened, then rounded again. It was dismissed as growth or diet. Poverty left no room for curiosity. The family could not afford to ask questions that might require a journey to town or a doctor's fee. When neighbors asked about Lina's swelling belly, her mother brushed it off. Too much corn, she'd say. Too little rest. In Tropos, superstition filled the gaps where medicine did not reach. Some said the mountains chose certain children for tests. Others muttered that spirits could live inside a child until they were ready to leave. No one thought in terms of anatomy or biology. It was easier to blame weather, fate, or rumor. Seasons turned and Lina kept growing. She played by the river with other children, but tired easily. Her mother noticed that she sometimes bled faintly and without reason. It frightened her, but she told no one. In their world, a girl's body changing that young carried shame, or worse, was seen as a sign of bad luck. Silence again was the safest choice. By the time Lina turned 5, her family's life had not changed. Dawn to dusk, work and worry. The child still followed her mother to market, still slept beside her parents in the small mud-walled home. Yet beneath the same roof, something irreversible was happening. Something no one around her could name, let alone stop. It would be months before her stomach grew round enough for anyone outside the family to notice. And when they did, they didn't call it pregnancy. They called it a curse. At the hospital in Lima, the disbelief didn't fade with time. Once the pregnancy was confirmed, doctors began to investigate the only question left. How could it have happened? A team of specialists from the University of San Marcos examined Lina. Her size, her voice, her mannerisms, everything about her said child. But her body told a different story. The examinations were clinical and methodical. Measurements were taken, hormone levels studied, and bone maturity evaluated. What they found made little sense. Lina's pelvic structure was nearly that of an adult woman. Her breasts were developed. Her reproductive organs were fully formed. It was as if time had passed differently inside her. Medical journals at the time used the term precocious puberty, an extremely rare condition where sexual development begins years before normal. For Lina, it had begun before memory itself. According to her mother, she had started menstrual bleeding before she turned 2. It was dismissed then as illness. Now doctors knew it had been the first sign. To confirm what they were seeing, Dr. Gerard Lozada requested additional evaluations. Radiographs of her wrists and pelvis showed that her bones were advanced well beyond her age. The internal scans, rudimentary by modern standards, confirmed ovulation cycles had been active for years. She was 5, but her body functioned like that of a grown woman. Outside the hospital, journalists began to swarm. Medical marvel, one headline called her. Another labeled her the child mother of the Andes. The attention disturbed the doctors who understood what those headlines ignored, that a biological anomaly did not explain how she had conceived. Behind every technical report was a reality no one wanted to confront. Still, within medical circles, curiosity overtook caution. Specialists arrived from Lima and beyond to observe her. They took belly ood samples, made sketches, and documented every physical feature. Their reports were clinical to the point of cruelty. Breast development corresponding to Tanner stage 5, uterus enlarged, ovarian function active. Not one line mentioned fear, trauma, or the psychological state of a 5-year-old girl carrying a child. Dr. Lazard, who had first discovered the pregnancy, began compiling notes for publication. He faced pressure to share his findings internationally as other physicians doubted the authenticity of the case. To them, it defied all known endocrinology. Some suggested fraud, others demanded photographic proof. Medical evidence was sent abroad, X-rays, hormone data, even sketches of the fetus before delivery. One American journal labeled it the most astonishing instance of precocious sexual development in recorded history. Within the hospital, staff spoke in whispers. The nurses refused to let her out of sight. They treated her carefully, more out of unease than sympathy. No one could explain how a body so small could carry life without collapsing. Yet she remained calm, expressionless, quiet. When asked if she understood what was happening, she said nothing. By the time her 7th month of pregnancy was confirmed, Lina had become both a medical specimen and an ethical dilemma. The doctors wanted to protect her, but they also wanted to understand her. Every test blurred that line further. When the results were compiled, the lead physician wrote a final note for the record. Precocious puberty, extreme onset before age 2, pregnancy full term, no precedent known. Years later, when asked about that discovery, one of the doctors involved refused to call it remarkable. His response was simple, almost reluctant. There was nothing miraculous about it. It was horror disguised as biology. After the birth, the question came faster than the headlines: who had done this? No one in the hospital, not even the doctors who delivered Lina's child, could accept that she had simply become pregnant. Someone was responsible, but in Ticaro, no one was willing to say who. Investigators arrived from Lima soon after the case drew national attention. The police interviewed Lina's parents first. Her mother was quiet, avoiding eye contact. Her father, a small man with calloused hands and the smell of clay and sweat, appeared nervous, but insisted he knew nothing. He said his daughter had always been healthy until her stomach began to swell. To him, she was still a baby. When officers pressed him about whether anyone might have harmed her, his answers became short and defensive. Some witnesses in the village claimed he had a temper. Others described him as hardworking and loyal to his family. The police didn't know which to believe. But in the absence of any other suspect, the father was arrested. The arrest made the newspapers immediately. Father accused in child-mother case, one headline read, printed beside an image of the small, frightened girl in hospital sheets. Reporters filled the story with speculation, not evidence. For the authorities, it was easier to assume guilt than to admit they had no idea who the perpetrator was. But the investigation led nowhere. Lina was too young to answer questions. Every attempt to interview her failed. She sat silent, staring at her hands or the floor. Doctors said she seemed detached, perhaps unable to understand what they were asking. No physical evidence tied the father to the crime, and within weeks he was released. The community's silence deepened. Some neighbors whispered that the father's arrest was only a formality, that he would never face punishment in a place where no one confessed and no one testified. Others Sugi instead a family friend or a laborer from outside the village. But even if anyone knew the truth, they refused to speak. In rural Peru of the 1930s, accusing a man of such an act was as dangerous as the act itself. Officials visited Ticrio again, hoping to uncover something new. They questioned the mother, extended relatives, even the local priest. The answers were the same. No one saw, no one heard, no one knew. The priest told them it was better to leave the matter in God's hands. To the outside world, that sounded like faith. To the villagers, it was survival. By then, the case had already shifted from criminal inquiry to medical spectacle. Doctors published papers. Journalists speculated about biology. But within the Medina home, the damage lingered unspoken. Lina's mother avoided questions from strangers. Her father, once released, stopped appearing in public. They returned to their work, pretending life had resumed its normal rhythm. The government never reopened the investigation. The files were brief. A few pages of testimony, a release order, a line in the margin, no evidence, case closed. For the doctors who had seen Lina's condition firsthand, the silence was unbearable. They understood that pregnancy, even under the rarest biological conditions, could not occur without assault. But medicine had no authority over law, and law had no courage against poverty and shame. Years later, when researchers revisited the case, they found nothing new. Just the same unanswered question buried under decades of avoidance. In every report and documentary that followed, the medical details were discussed in full. Yet the crime behind them was treated like rumor. Lina's childhood had not ended when she gave birth. It had ended long before, sometime between the silence of her parents and the inaction of a community that chose not to see. And in the official archives of Peru, beneath her diagnosis and delivery notes, one question remains unwritten but inescapable. Who touched the child? On May 14, 1939, The operating room at the maternity hospital of Lima was sealed off to all but a handful of staff. The doors were locked, blinds drawn, and a silence settled that no one could break. Every person in that room knew the world was watching, not directly but through the weight of what was about to happen. At the center of the room lay 5-year-old Lina Medina, barely conscious under anesthesia, her small frame dwarfed by the surgical table. Around her stood Dr. Gerardo Lozada, who had discovered the pregnancy months earlier, and a team of 3 specialists from the University of San Marcos. They had debated for weeks whether a natural birth could be attempted, but her pelvis was far too small. A caesarean section was the only option. Nurses prepared the instruments in quiet sequence. Scalpel, forceps, sutures, everything sterilized twice over. The lead anesthetist whispered her dosage under his breath as though afraid of the sound. In medical history there were precedents for early pregnancies, but never this early, never this impossible. Dr. Lozada steadied his hands. "Begin," someone murmured. The first incision was made. No one spoke after that. The room filled only with the rhythmic clatter of instruments and the muted hum of the overhead light. A few minutes later, one of the assisting surgeons exhaled sharply. The amniotic sac had been reached. The others leaned forward. There was movement. Within seconds, a nurse prepared a blanket. Lozada lifted the newborn carefully, more from disbelief than triumph. The child was full-term, healthy, pink, and breathing. He let out a single cry that echoed through the sterile room, thin, strong, and unmistakably alive. For a moment, no one moved. The cry carried through every person present like a reminder of what had just happened. A child had given birth to a child. Medicine had crossed a threshold it wasn't ready to face. The newborn weighed 2.7 kilograms, about 6 pounds. He was named Gerardo after the doctor who had delivered him. In later records, his health was described as excellent. No deformities, no complications. The mother, still unconscious, was stable. Her recovery would take weeks. Dr. Lazard stepped back and removed his gloves slowly. He later admitted that he didn't feel pride or accomplishment, only a kind of unease that he couldn't explain. "We proved what should never have been possible," he said years later. Outside the operating room, reporters had already begun gathering, though none were allowed in. The news spread within hours. Sealed, mother gives birth to child. Hospitals across the world requested confirmation. Skeptics demanded X-rays, birth certificates, sworn statements. The evidence was sent: surgical notes, photographs of the newborn, and medical attestations signed by multiple physicians. Every piece of documentation said the same thing. The event had occurred. In the recovery ward, Lina stirred awake under heavy sedation. She did not ask to see the baby. Her first words were for her mother, who sat nearby. Nurses kept the newborn in a separate room, attended to constantly, photographed repeatedly. Within days his image, not hers, was in newspapers from Lima to London. When she was told her baby was healthy, Lina reportedly nodded once and turned away. She did not cry. For the doctors, that sound in the operating room, the cry that broke the silence, would stay with them forever. It was proof of their success, but also the moment they realized success was the wrong word. A living child had been born. But so had a moral wound no medicine could close. And in the stillness that followed that first cry, every person present understood that history had just taken a step too far. When Lina Medina left the hospital, she was not sent home as a mother, but as a child who happened to have one. Her baby Gerardo was taken in by her parents and presented to the world and to their own community as Lina's younger brother. On paper that story worked. To outsiders, it was easier to believe that than to confront what had really happened. The arrangement seemed practical, even merciful at first. Lina was barely 6, still unable to tie her shoes or read. The family agreed it would be best for everyone if she continued to live as she had before. Her mother took on the duties of raising the infant. Her father, who had already been under suspicion and arrest, spoke to no one about it. Within the walls of their small home, nothing was discussed. The baby's crib was placed beside Lina's bed. She helped feed him, bathe him, and lull him to sleep. But when anyone asked who the baby belonged to, she repeated what her parents had told her. "He's my brother." The doctors who had witnessed the birth visited occasionally to monitor both children's health. They reported that Lina was well adjusted, though that was a polite fiction. She rarely spoke. She avoided eye contact. When journalists appeared at their door, a regular occurrence in the first few years, her mother would hide her in the back room until they left. In Tipo, curiosity was curer than pity. Neighbors whispered when the family passed. Some saw the event as divine punishment, others as proof of sorcery. The village priest refused to baptize the baby until months after his birth, saying he needed assurance of his origin. When the baptism finally happened, the record listed the child's parents as unknown. Lina started school, but it didn't last. Other children called her names they didn't fully understand, repeating fragments they'd overheard from adults. Her mother withdrew her from class after only a few months. From then on, Lina stayed home caring for Gerardo and pretending their relationship was what everyone said it was. She never corrected anyone. Meanwhile, the outside world's fascination hadn't ended. Journalists continued to publish updates how the child mother was faring, how the boy was growing. Some foreign medical journals printed photographs of both children under clinical captions. Lina's family received no money for any of it. As Gerardo grew, the lie grew with him. He called Lina sister, and she answered to it with quiet acceptance. To him, she was simply the girl who watched over him, who took him to market, who shared her food. When he scraped his knees or cried at night, she comforted him like any older sibling would. To everyone else it looked like a normal family. But silence has its own cost. By the time Lina entered her teens, she had learned to live inside that silence, never correcting, never revealing. Her parents forbade any mention of the past. Reporters were turned away with anger. The case had embarrassed not just the family but the entire region, and most people wanted it buried. Yet secrets don't stay buried in small towns. By the time Gerardo turned 10, he began to overhear fragments, gossip from adults, old newspaper clippings, whispered questions. He confronted his family one afternoon demanding the truth. His grandmother broke down crying before anyone answered. It was then, in a house built on denial, that the truth finally found a voice. The boy realized the sister he adored had been his mother all along. And in that moment of clarity, the cruelest irony became clear. The only person who hadn't known the truth was the child born from it. After the birth, Lina Medina's story stopped belonging to her. It became property of hospitals, universities, and men in white coats who saw a miracle of anatomy instead of a tragedy of circumstance. The Peruvian medical community rushed to document what they called the youngest recorded case of human maternity. In their eyes, she wasn't a person to protect. She was an anomaly to study. Within weeks, teams from the University of San Marcos and the Maternity Hospital of Lima began compiling medical records. They photographed her before and after surgery, charted her hormonal levels, and measured bone density. Every inch of her body was observed, described, and archived. Her case file included radiographs, menstrual charts, and developmental notes written in detached language. Subject exhibits secondary sexual characteristics corresponding to an adult female. Those reports circulated quickly through Latin American medical circles and soon after across the world. The Revista Médica Peruana published the first summary, calling it a case of scientific importance demonstrating extreme precocity. American and European journals soon followed. The American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology requested the original X-rays. The Journal of Clinical Endocrinology referenced her hormonal data in a study on precocious puberty. Each publication treated her not as Lina, but as the Peruvian girl age 5. Dr. Gerard Lozada, the physician who had delivered her baby, was invited to present the case at conferences in Lima and later in the United States. In his talks, he described the condition clinically. Ovarian activity before age 2, full sexual maturity before age 5, spontaneous conception. He never speculated about who impregnated her. That question was dismissed as irrelevant to the science. The audience applauded his findings. Lina, meanwhile, sat in the corner of examination rooms waiting. Doctors would arrive, shake hands with her parents, and speak about her as if she were invisible. Translators explain little. She was poked, measured, and photographed again. The same procedures repeated for years. Every test deepened the medical understanding of her body while erasing the person who lived inside it. For researchers, Lina's case became a reference point. In textbooks and lectures, her name was invoked beside phrases like precocious ovulation and endocrine irregularity. But there were no sections about consent, no mention of trauma, no ethical review. To the men writing the papers, she was evidence, the youngest example ever recorded. Newspapers amplified the spectacle. Life magazine requested photographs. Wire agencies offered money for interviews. The family declined, but the story circulated anyway. Lina's face appeared beside medical diagrams in foreign publications she would never read. Each time a photo was reprinted, her anonymity shrank further. Within Peru, she became a subject of uneasy pride. Officials cited her case as a sign of the nation's scientific contribution, a phrase that ignored the cost of her exposure. She was paraded quietly, not in public halls, but in academic slideshows and lectures that would outlive her privacy. By the mid-1940s, she was no longer being examined, not because anyone decided to stop, but because science had moved on. The doctors had learned what they could. Her file was complete. The photographs and x-rays remained in archives used for decades as teaching material in medical schools. Years later, one nurse who had assisted during those examinations recalled seeing Lina sitting silently at the edge of a room while doctors debated hormone ratios over her head. She looked small even then. The nurse said they spoke for hours and she didn't speak once. That image would linger long after the research papers were forgotten. A child who had carried life, now reduced to data, sitting in silence while the men around her discussed her body as though she wasn't even there. By the summer of 1939, the story had spread far beyond Peru. It crossed oceans and telegrams, appeared in American and European papers, and quickly became a global spectacle. World's youngest mother, age 5, read the headlines. Bold, sensational, and stripped of humanity. For editors, it was the perfect story, shocking, unthinkable, and conveniently distant. Reporters described the case in the language of wonder, as though Lina's suffering were a curiosity of nature rather than an act of violence. Some newspapers called her the miracle of the Andes. Others chose words like freakish and scientific marvel. Medical journals, tabloids, and religious columns all competed to frame the event in their own image. Science claiming it as a discovery. Faith branding it as punishment. In the United States, the story became a moral battleground. Newspapers printed grainy photos of Lina sitting upright in a hospital bed, her expression blank, captioned with phrases like, "Mother at 5." Letters poured into editorial offices. Some from doctors demanding access to her medical data, others from readers expressing disbelief or disgust. One syndicated article claimed she had been chosen by God to demonstrate human possibility. None of them asked whether she wanted to be demonstrated at all. The case was discussed at medical congresses in Lima, Buenos Aires, and later in Chicago. Dr. Gerardo Lozado's presentations were summarized in English under the headline, "Case Without Parallel in Medical History." Slides of Lina's x-rays were projected in lecture halls as men in suits took notes. Her body, once her own, was now a global illustration. The fascination wasn't limited to scientists. Tabloids published stories under titles like Child Bride of Nature and Mother or Monster. They described the village of Tekapo as a land of primitive innocence, painting the entire region, as something exotic and backward, a narrative that made Western readers feel both horrified and superior. Peruvian officials, embarrassed by the attention, tried to control the story but failed. Journalists arrived in Lima seeking interviews and photographs. Some even traveled to Trepo, offering money to neighbors for details about the family. A few sold what they knew or pretended to. Myths began to circulate that Lina's child was stillborn, that the pregnancy was faked, that she had been part of a tribal ritual. Each rumor made the truth smaller. As Lina recovered, doctors shielded her from most visitors, but the intrusion was constant. Flashbulbs startled her. Reporters asked her to hold her baby for photos she didn't understand. When she refused to speak, newspapers labeled her mute, as though silence were a defect instead of self-preservation. Behind closed doors, the medical staff debated what to do with the attention. Some wanted to protect her. Others saw an opportunity for prestige. Her case offered career advancement, funding, recognition. Every time an article was published, her identity was traded again. The church released statements condemning what had happened, but offered no investigation. Moralists used her story to argue about purity and sin. Scientists dissected it in terms of hormones and statistics, and the press packaged it all into a narrative the public could consume. A child turned into a phenomenon. Her trauma translated into entertainment. By the end of 1940, Lina's family withdrew from the city. They stopped answering questions, stopped opening their door. Her parents moved her and the baby to a quieter neighborhood outside Lima. When reporters finally tracked her down, they found a girl no longer smiling for photographs. She had learned what the world really wanted from her. Not her story but her image. Not her truth but her roof. And from that point on, Lina Medina stopped letting herself be seen, realizing the world had mistaken her tragedy for a miracle, and her pain for science's proudest discovery. When the cameras disappeared, so did everyone who had promised to help. The government had made public pledges. Financial support, medical care, education for Lina, housing for her family. Officials wanted to be seen as protectors of a national miracle, symbols of compassion after a scandal that embarrassed Peru. But once the headlines cooled, Those promises dissolved into paperwork that no one signed and letters that no one answered. In late 1940, Lina's family left the Crapo for Lima, hoping the city would offer opportunity. What they found instead was a maze of crowded streets and temporary shelters on the city's outskirts. They rented a single-room dwelling in a neighborhood known for its poverty, a place locals called El Peno, Chicago for its crime and chaos. For a family that had been a national headline only a year before, the fall into obscurity was brutal. Lina's mother found occasional work washing clothes. Her father took day jobs carrying cement or hauling lumber, always quiet, never mentioning the past. When neighbors asked about the story, he dismissed it. "Journalists lie," he'd mutter, ending the conversation. His denial was his defense. Pretending it hadn't happened was easier than living under the weight of what it meant. Doctors had promised to follow up with medical support for Lina and her baby. None came. A few months after their move, the visits stopped entirely. No one from the hospital sent letters. No one from the government checked if they had food or shelter. The same institutions that had examined her body so carefully forgot to remember her life. Lina returned to the routines of a poor child, cooking, cleaning, tending to her son. He was healthy, full of energy, unaware that the people who had once called him a miracle now couldn't recall his name. At night, when the streets filled with noise and stray dogs, Lina sat with him on the flute, or telling simple stories, her voice low so her father wouldn't hear. Occasionally, reporters would track her down again years apart, chasing the ghost of the story that had made them famous. Each time, they were surprised to find her living in poverty, her home made of sheet metal and scrap wood. Some wrote sympathetic follow-ups describing her as the forgotten child mother. Others simply moved on when they saw there was nothing to photograph. The state's neglect became the final chapter no one wanted to print. Officials had gained prestige from her case, but offered nothing lasting. Medical institutions kept her records for study, but never used them to ensure her safety or future. She had given them fame. They repaid her with silence. As Lina grew older, the attention she once received curdled into stigma. Neighbors whispered that misfortune followed her. Men stared, women avoided her. The same society that had paraded her story as a medical wonder now treated her like something cursed. By the time she entered her teens, Lina was a mother, a sister, and a child all at once. A contradiction the world had built and then abandoned. Poverty hardened her early. She rarely smiled, rarely looked up when people spoke to her. Survival had replaced trust. In the end, the story that had shocked the world faded not with resolution, but with indifference. The newspapers stopped printing her name. The government stopped pretending to care. And the doctors who had made their careers from her case found new ones to study. In a city of millions, no one remembered the 5-year-old who had rewritten medical history. And on one ordinary night, beneath the flicker of a dying street light, a mother and her child sat alone on a curb, 2 lives bound by silence, swallowed by a city that had already moved on. By the time Lina Medina turned 12, she had already been a mother for 7 years. The boy she had once been told was her brother, was now old enough to walk to the market with her, old enough to ask questions she struggled to answer. In Lima, no one called them a miracle anymore. They were simply another poor family. 2 faces among thousands trying to survive. Lina's days began before sunrise. She fetched water, swept the dirt floor of their small room, and prepared breakfast, a routine that left little space for childhood. Her son Gerardo followed her everywhere. He clung to her skirt when she went to buy bread, sat beside her when she washed clothes, and waited silently when she stared out the window, lost in thought. School was never steady for her. The hospital had promised she would receive an education, but the funding stopped as soon as the reporters did. When she managed to attend classes, her presence caused whispers. Children stared, some recognizing her from old photographs shown in magazines their parents still kept. She sat at the back of the room saying little, finishing her lessons quickly, leaving early. Eventually she stopped going altogether. Raising Gerard was work she never chose but couldn't abandon. Her mother, older now and often sick, left most of the care to Lina. She did what she could, fed him, dressed him, comforted him. But the bond was different, uncertain. When he called her sister, she didn't correct him. When he grew angry, sensing the unspoken tension around his name and birth, she let him go quiet. Neighbors noticed the strange distance between them. Some thought she was cold. Others, seeing her fatigue, pied her. In truth, she had learned to live without emotion because it was easier that way. Feelings drew attention. Silence kept her safe. Work came in small forms, cleaning, sewing, occasional help in a nearby show. She gave whatever she earned to her mother for rent and food. There was never enough. In the evening she sat by the door, watching the street, her son playing nearby, his laughter mixing with the noise of the city. Sometimes she smiled, sometimes she didn't. The newspapers had long forgotten her by then. The same journalists who once demanded photographs now covered wars, elections, and scandals more profitable than the quiet life of a girl they had already used. If any remembered her name, it was as a medical footnote, not a person. Lina's father remained withdrawn, still refusing to speak about the past. The silence inside their home was heavy but familiar. No one mentioned the case, not even when foreign letters arrived asking for follow-up interviews. The family never replied. By her mid-teens, Lina had become unrecognizable from the frightened child who once lay on an operating table. She had grown into a young woman marked by endurance, not experience. Her youth had been traded away piece by piece to doctors, to journalists, to survival. She never spoke publicly about her feelings toward her son, but those who lived near them said she was protective in quiet ways, making sure he ate first, walking him to school, waiting until he was out of sight before returning home. She never raised her voice, never smiled easily. Life had taught her that too much expression invited questions, and questions led back to pain. When night came and the city's hum faded to silence, Lina would sit beside the small bed they shared and watch him sleep. He was the only thing she had truly kept, the only evidence of everything she had endured. In those moments she didn't think about headlines or doctors or God. She only thought about how tired she was. Not the kind of tired that comes from work, but the exhaustion of someone who never got to be a child before becoming someone, his mother. The lie had lasted 10 years. In the Medina household, it had become routine, repeated so often that it began to sound like truth. Lina was the sister. Gerard was the youngest child, and the family pretended not to notice the way neighbors looked at them when the name Medina appeared again in old newspaper clippings. But lies have an expiration date. For Gerardo, it came quietly through whispers not meant for his ears. He was 10, attending a local school near Lima. One afternoon a teacher pulled him aside, her tone gentle but uncertain. She had seen a magazine article, a retrospective piece written by a journalist revisiting the world's youngest mother. The story included names, ages, and a single photograph from 1939. The boy in her classroom matched the face of the child in the picture. At home that evening, Gerardo asked questions, small at first, about why photographers sometimes followed their family, why people seemed to recognize them. His grandmother tried to change the subject. His grandfather left the room. Lina froze. The words she had avoided her entire life waited just beyond her throat, and she couldn't form them. In the following weeks, the story resurfaced in local press. A Lima newspaper published an anniversary piece framing Lina as a woman of extraordinary endurance. They described her son, now a schoolboy, as healthy and bright. They didn't ask for permission to print it. They never did. Neighbors began to talk again. Children at Gerard's school repeated fragments of what their parents read aloud at dinner. He came home angry and confused. He had been told he was the youngest of the family, but classmates now called him the miracle baby. When he asked Lina directly, she hesitated, then looked away. It was her mother, old and tired, who finally broke the silence. "You must know the truth," she said, her voice trembling. "Your sister is not your sister." The words fell into the small room like a stone dropped into still water. No one spoke after that. Lina walked outside. Gerardo sat still staring at the floor. It took several minutes before he asked the only question that mattered. "Then who is my father?" There was no answer. In the days that followed, journalists returned, drawn by the renewed interest. They knocked on doors, offered money, demanded interviews. Some wanted photographs of the grown boy beside the woman once called the 5-year-old mother. The family refused all requests, but photographs still appeared in print. Reprints of the same hospital images from decades earlier, captioned with fresh commentary. The intrusion reopened everything Lina had tried to bury. Strangers wrote letters. Foreign outlets demanded statements, but the Medinas said nothing. The government offered no protection. The story wasn't scandal anymore, just curiosity. For Gerardo, the truth changed everything. The woman he'd always called sister now looked at him differently, not out of shame but sorrow. He stopped speaking to her for a time. School became unbearable. He avoided public places, sensing whispers even where none existed. Lina tried to explain, but every word felt wrong. How do you tell your child that the world treated his birth like a laboratory experiment, that his existence was used to sell newspapers and advance careers? She didn't have the language and he didn't want it. Eventually the press moved on again, leaving behind another layer of damage. Lina and Gerardo returned to their quiet routines, But the air between them had changed. They were family still, but no longer in the way they had been. Years later, when asked about that time, one neighbor recalled seeing the boy sitting outside alone, staring at nothing. He looked like he was trying to make sense of something too big for him. She said he had learned the truth, but truth did not bring peace. Only confusion, anger, and a single question that would never be answered. Why me? By the 1960s, Lima had changed. The city was growing upward. Glass offices replacing the narrow adobe buildings that had once lined its center. Somewhere inside one of those new offices, Lina Medina sat behind a desk, typing medical reports for the man who had delivered her baby more than 2 decades earlier. Dr. Gerardo Lozada was now a respected physician, head of a clinic known for its precision and modernity. His reputation, built partly on the case that had made Lina famous, had carried him far beyond Peru's borders. Foreign journals still cited his 1939 report as a landmark in obstetric science. But the girl who had been that report, his patient, his proof, was now an employee in his office. She worked quietly, efficiently, and without conversation. Her job was routine, transcribing case notes, organizing patient files, managing correspondence. She rarely looked up when visitors entered, and most had no idea who she was. Lozada never introduced her by name beyond "my secretary." Few ever made the connection between the young woman at the typewriter and the medical marvel whose X-rays had once been displayed at international conferences. For Lina, the work offered stability. It was steady pay, a place where no one asked about her past, and an employer she knew would never expose her because his own name was tied to hers. Their relationship existed on unspoken terms. He had delivered her child. She now delivered his paperwork. He had once written reports about her. She now typed reports for him. It was symmetry born from necessity, not choice. Those who worked at the clinic later described her as reserved but capable. She never spoke about her personal life, though she kept a small photograph of her son tucked inside a notebook. By then, Gerardo was a grown man working as a clerk himself. The two rarely saw each other. The past had taught them both the safety of distance. Lina's presence in Lozada's office carried an irony that no one seemed willing to name. The same man who had once presented her body as a case study now depended on her labor to maintain his practice. Every document she typed, every chart, every patient record passed through the same hands that had once been catalogued in medical journals without her consent. Yet there was no visible resentment in her. She was punctual, polite, and self-contained. It was not loyalty that kept her there, but the absence of alternatives. Employment for women in Lima during that era was limited. Employment for a woman with her history was nearly impossible. The doctor's clinic was one of the few places where her silence was not questioned. It was expected. Sometimes when Lozada prepared papers for medical lectures, Lina was asked to retype sections of his original 1939 case report. The language was the same as it had been decades earlier. Subject: age 5 years, presented a term with pregnancy resulting in live birth. She read the lines without expression, typed them word for word, then placed them neatly in a folder marked historical case file. No one in the office noticed how her posture stiffened each time the word subject appeared on the page. Lozada, now older, treated her with distant respect, but there was no friendship between them, only quiet acknowledgement. He rarely spoke of the past, though occasionally when dictating a note, he would pause mid-sentence, his voice softening before he continued. Lina never asked what he was thinking. She didn't need to. Both of them understood that her employment, her anonymity, and his reputation were bound by the same fragile thread. What had once been done could never be undone. Each evening, when the clinic emptied, Lina remained behind to finish the day's typing. The sound of the keys echoed through the corridor, steady and mechanical. On her desk lay a copy of one of Lozada's papers, the one that had defined her life before she was old enough to read it. She straightened the pages, rolled a fresh sheet into the typewriter, and began to type the final line, the same name that had once appeared beneath hers in every report. Dr. Gerardo Lozada. And as the carriage struck the end of the line, the woman whose childhood had filled those pages sat quietly in the same room, transcribing the story that had once stolen her own. By the time Lina Medina reached her late 30s, she had already lived more than one lifetime. The headlines that once defined her had yellowed, the doctors who studied her had retired, and the journalists who once demanded her story had stopped asking. In the silence that followed, Lina did something no one expected. She began a new life on her own terms. She met a man named Raul Gurdo, a quiet office worker from Lima. There are no interviews, no detailed records of how they met, only a single note in an old newspaper that referred to him as a kind man who gave her a normal life. They married in the early 1970s. For the first time, Lina was not someone's patient, someone's subject, or someone's secret. She was simply a wife living in a small apartment near the edge of the city. In 1972, at the age of 38, she became pregnant again. This time there was no panic, no surgeons debating, no headlines. It was not an experiment. It was her decision. The doctors who examined her were aware of her history, but they treated her with quiet respect. The pregnancy was uneventful, ordinary, which was the greatest relief of all. Those close to her said she rarely spoke of her past, even to her husband. When asked about it, she would give a small shake of the head and change the subject. The child she carried now was not a reminder of what had been taken from her, but proof of what she had regained: choice, privacy, and peace. When her son was born later that year, Lina named him without consulting anyone. She refused interviews, turned away reporters who had somehow found her address, and insisted that no one publish his name. The newspapers, unable to confirm the story, printed short lines of speculation. The world's youngest mother has become a mother again. It was news but no longer scandal. This second child grew up in anonymity, untouched by the mythology that had surrounded his mother's first pregnancy. Lina raised him quietly, keeping her distance from the institutions that had once claimed authority over her life. There were no public records of her ever visiting her former doctor again, though it's likely she still worked in the same administrative circles that had sustained her. Those who saw her in those years described her as calm, deliberate, and older than her age in spirit. She walked her son to school, waited outside until the bell rang, and never spoke of the past. She lived as though she were protecting him not just from the world's judgment but from its memory. It was in many ways an unremarkable chapter. And that ordinariness was its victory. For the first time, Lina experienced motherhood as something she chose, not something imposed upon her. There were no medical journals recording her condition, no photographers intruding into her recovery, no priests or politicians debating her morality, just a woman, her husband, and a newborn child. The life that followed was small and quiet. Her husband worked, her son grew, and Lina stayed out of sight. She never gave interviews again, never spoke publicly about either of her children. The world had once stolen her privacy. Now she guarded it fiercely. When she looked at her new son, those who knew her said she was gentler than she had ever been before, not smiling often but softer, her voice lower, her presence less guarded. It was not redemption. Nothing could erase what had happened. But in that small apartment in Lima, in the quiet rhythm of days without witnesses, Lina Medina had done something no doctor, journalist, or institution could claim to have given her. For the first time, motherhood belonged to her. In 1979, the story that had once shocked the world came quietly to an end. Gerardo Medina, the boy who had been born to a 5-year-old mother, died at the age of 40 from a bone marrow disease. There were no headlines announcing it, no front-page photographs, no commemorative essays about the child who had rewritten medical history. His death passed almost unnoticed. A line in a local obituary column, a whisper among former hospital staff, nothing more. For Lina, it was the final confirmation that her life and his had never truly belonged to them. She had given birth to him under lights and observation, raised him under scrutiny, and watched him carry the weight of a secret he had never asked to bear. Now, as he was buried in a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of Lima, there were no cameras to witness the ending. Only her, standing beside the grave, silent as she had always been. The newspapers eventually found out, of course they always did. Within days, short articles began to appear in foreign outlets. Child mother loses grown son, one headline read. Another called it the closing chapter of a medical wonder. The tone was clinical, almost detached. The writers, none of whom had ever met Lina or her son, spoke as if documenting the end of an experiment rather than the death of a man. They wrote about his childhood health, his supposed resemblance to his mother, his education, anything but the life he had actually lived. Reporters tried to reach Lina for comment, but she refused to answer. By then, she had long since learned that silence was her only form of defense. Friends later said she stopped leaving the house for months. She didn't attend church, avoided neighbors, and declined the occasional letter from journalists still chasing the story. The woman, who had once been the focus of the world's gaze, now wanted nothing more than to disappear from it entirely. The few people who remained close to her described her grief as quiet, not outward but constant, the kind that lingers in still rooms and slow movements. She never spoke of Gerardo again. His belongings were packed away and never touched. The son she had been forced to call her brother had been the single constant in her life, the one person who shared her burden. Without him, the silence of her home deepened into something permanent. The international press, unable to extract new quotes or photographs, quickly turned the event into retrospectives. They reprinted the old hospital images, the same grainy black and white photo of Lina as a child, eyes wide and expressionless beside the infant she never got to name publicly. None of the articles mentioned how she lived now or that her privacy had been the one thing she had spent her life fighting for. One Peruvian reporter managed to reach her by telephone. When asked if she would be willing to speak about her son's death, Lina paused for several seconds before giving her only recorded response. "There is nothing more to say." The reporter wrote that down word for word. It became the closing line of his article, printed under a photo that was nearly 4 decades old. After Gerardo's death, Lina withdrew completely from public life. She refused all interviews and stopped appearing in public records. It was as though the world's youngest mother had vanished with the son who had defined her existence. In the years that followed, historians and medical students continued to cite her name in journals and textbooks, but always in the same way, as a case, not a person. Her name appeared alongside data points, never emotions. Gerardo had entered the world surrounded by doctors, cameras, and disbelief. He left it with none of those things. And as the headlines faded once more, the truth became painfully clear. The world remembered her story, but it never remembered her pain. Today, Lina Medina is believed to be in her 90s. She lives quietly somewhere in Lima, Peru, though few can say exactly where. No photographs have surfaced in decades. No interviews, no new information beyond what was printed long ago. Her story, once a sensation across continents, has faded into near myth. To most people, she is a name without a face, a case without a person. What remains are records, hospital notes, x-rays, medical papers, citations and textbooks describing the youngest confirmed mother in human history. Her life has been reduced to data points and footnotes. In scientific literature, her name is attached to words like precocious puberty and biological anomaly. None mention trauma. None mention survival. Over time, her case became a cautionary tale for medicine itself, not about biology but about ethics. How far a field once driven by curiosity can drift from compassion. The doctors who examined her advanced their careers. The researchers who published her story built reputations on it. The institutions that promised to protect her profited instead from her exposure. And when the attention ended, they left her behind. The same can be said of society. The world that had treated her suffering as spectacle never apologized, never offered reparation, never asked how she lived afterward. She was paraded through journals and headlines as both miracle and scandal, then abandoned to anonymity once the fascination wore off. It is a pattern still recognizable today. A survivor turned into a symbol until the next story arrives. For Lina, anonymity was not failure. It was protection. She had spent her entire life being seen too much and by the wrong kind of eyes. Every photograph, every printed paragraph had taken something from her. Privacy became the only freedom she had left. In that sense, her disappearance from public view wasn't an accident. It was an act of survival. The Peruvian government never reopened her case. No one was ever charged. The truth about what happened to her as a child was buried in silence, the kind that protects everyone except the victim. In the decades since, activists and journalists have cited her story as a reminder of how institutions fail the powerless, how exploitation can masquerade as interest, and how a child's suffering can be rewritten as medical history. Ethicists studying her case now use it as an example of everything that should never happen again. A lack of consent, a lack of dignity, a life turned into a laboratory exhibit. Yet even in those discussions, Lina herself remains invisible. Her personhood continues to exist behind the text, never in it. Some say she worked quietly into old age, raising her second son away from the public eye. Others say she still lives in the same modest home she shared with her husband, avoiding visitors. Whatever the truth, she has kept the promise she made to herself long ago to never let the world claim her story again. Outside of academic circles, few remember her name. Fewer still understand the weight she carried. In the digital age, her story resurfaces occasionally in documentaries, online articles, social media posts that recycle the same facts and photographs. Each time the reaction is the same mixture of disbelief and fascination, as though the horror were entertainment. There is no record of Lina Medina ever speaking about her life publicly. Not once. No autobiography, no interviews, no statements. Her silence has lasted longer than her fame. And in that silence lies a kind of indictment of medicine, of journalism, of every system that failed to see her as human. Lina Medina was 5 years old when the world took her childhood. Nearly a century later, it still hasn't given her privacy back. The world called her a miracle, a medical marvel, a curiosity. But history tells a simpler, colder truth. The world documented her pregnancy, not her life.